The night hung heavy over rural Georgia, so heavy that it felt like the air itself was pressing against your chest. Imagine walking through a yard where every step sinks into damp earth, where the smell of wet leaves, old wood, and sweat mingles so thickly that it clings to your clothes. The cicadas screamed endlessly from the trees, a high, almost mechanical hum that filled every corner of the night. And yet, in that noisy, restless symphony, a single sound, a soft, frightened whimper, might have gone entirely unnoticed. You can almost feel it, can't you? That little quiver of human fear, so fragile, almost swallowed by the darkness. The moon hung low, pale and indifferent, casting weak silver light over the dirt yard behind the plantation house. Its glow was cold, almost clinical, illuminating the rough textures of the walls, the shadows of the tall oaks, the edges of a lantern swinging gently in a trembling hand. That light didn't move because of the wind. No, it moved because the person holding it was shaking, fear coursing through every finger, every bone, every thought. Somewhere nearby, a woman was about to discover that speaking her mind could cost her everything, and in that moment the world seemed to pause, holding its breath along with her. You see, history has taught us that slavery was about chains, whips, and loud punishments. And yes, those things were there, brutal, obvious, and terrifying. But sometimes the cruelty was quieter. Sometimes it was intimate, personal. Sometimes it came not from a whip, but from a needle, from thread, from the subtle, methodical erosion of a person's humanity. Her name was Hannah, or at least that's the name that survived. Snippets of court records, fragments of letters, whispers passed down in stories that weren't meant to be told aloud. Hannah worked as a seamstress on a plantation outside Macon, Georgia, in the year 1854. She was in her early 30s, strong, precise, alert, someone whose hands remembered every stitch she'd ever made and whose eyes noticed everything, from a crooked seam to the way someone avoided your gaze. Her job was laborious, sewing dresses for the mistress and her daughters, patching the rough work clothes of field hands, mending whatever broke under the weight of both hard labor and harsher lives. But what made Hannah dangerous wasn't her skill with a needle. It wasn't even her efficiency or her keen eye for detail. What made Hannah dangerous was her voice. Not loud, not shrill, not foolish, but clear, honest, unafraid. She asked questions when she needed answers. She corrected mistakes when she saw them. And in a world that demanded absolute obedience, even calm honesty felt like rebellion. Now, imagine being that woman. Imagine knowing that every word you spoke could tip the balance between life and death. Imagine feeling the eyes of someone like Margaret Whitcombe, the mistress of the plantation house, scanning you, measuring you, silently weighing whether your words were defiance. Margaret, a woman raised on the idea that control was love and punishment was virtue, had built a life on perfect order, floors scrubbed until they shone, dresses pressed with mechanical precision, silence when she entered a room, every gesture, every glance, calculated. And when Hannah spoke, just once, just clearly, she threatened that carefully constructed world. One afternoon the tension snapped. Margaret was inspecting a dress, a seemingly trivial detail, a seam slightly off, the kind of mistake most eyes would overlook. She called Hannah forward, pointing with a sharp finger, and demanded an explanation. Hannah looked at the fabric. She swallowed. And she spoke the truth. "It's cut wrong, ma'am, from the start." Nothing loud, nothing angry, just honest, and that honesty sounded like defiance. Margaret's face tightened, that subtle shift that reveals a person's authority slipping. She asked Hannah to repeat herself. Hannah did. Same words, same calm tone. And in that quiet moment, everything changed. Margaret didn't see a seamstress pointing out a mistake. She saw a slave correcting her, talking back. Now the punishments on plantations were predictable: whippings, starvation, isolation, public humiliation. But Margaret wanted something different, something symbolic, something permanent enough to instill fear without creating immediate scandal. According to testimony recorded years later, she said, "If she values her mouth so much, we'll teach it silence." That night, Hannah was taken behind the house. No crowd, no spectacle, just Margaret, 2 overseers, and a sewing kit, the very kit Hannah had used 1,000 times before. Thick needles, coarse thread, instruments that should have built clothing, instead poised to enforce obedience in the cruelest, most intimate way. I won't dwell on every brutal detail, not because it didn't matter, but because the horror is so much more vivid when you imagine it yourself. What matters is that Hannah's mouth was forced closed, stitch by stitch. Not tightly enough to kill her immediately, but tight enough to hurt, swell, bleed. They thought it would last a day or two, just a lesson. But there was a problem. Hannah could no longer eat or drink properly. Her lips swelled, infection set in, blood filled her mouth, slow and warm, and at night she struggled to breathe, choking, gagging, unable to call for help. The overseers didn't intervene. Her suffering, they said, was her own fault. Shouldn't have spoken. By the third day, she collapsed. Other enslaved women gathered around her, their faces etched with fear and grief. One tried to clean the blood with a damp cloth. Another whispered prayers through tears. They spoke in whispers because they knew that even small sounds could cost them their lives. They cared, but they also feared. A local doctor was finally summoned, not for mercy but for fear. Fear that a death like this might attract outside attention. The stitches were removed. Too late. Hannah had already inhaled blood into her lungs. That night she died, shaking and gasping on the dirt floor of a cabin she had never owned. Even after her death, the story persisted. A letter from the doctor, barely preserved, described it as an excessive correction. Abolitionist newspapers printed fragments, careful to omit her name, careful to avoid justice, but the horror was still there, still palpable. Margaret Whitcombe was questioned by authorities, not charged, not punished. She claimed it was a temporary restraint. The court accepted her word. Life went on. But among the enslaved community, Hannah's story endured. Mothers whispered warnings to daughters, "Be careful with your words." Elders remembered our hands, her skill, the faint hum she carried while sewing. Some said that afterward, Margaret never slept well again, that she complained of hearing choking sounds at night. Maybe that's true. Maybe not. What is true is that Hannah's voice terrified a system built on silence, and even when they tried to erase her, literally stitch by stitch, it survived. Because Hannah spoke once, just once, and nearly 2 centuries later, we are still listening. Before Hannah became the seamstress whose voice would one day terrify a system built on silence, she was just a girl running barefoot across the same Georgia fields that would later witness her suffering. Imagine the sun beating down, the tall grass swaying in the breeze, the cicadas already beginning their constant, high-pitched chorus. She would have been small, maybe 10 or 11, but already sharp, already observant. She noticed everything: a bent blade of grass, the way her mother's hands moved when she churned butter, the subtle shifts in her father's expression when an overseer passed by. She learned early that survival wasn't just about speed or strength. It was about awareness, about understanding how people moved, how they spoke, how they could be tamed without being touched. Hannah's mother, Ruth, was a woman who carried both fire and fear. Her eyes could pierce a man's soul one moment, and the next they would soften as she soothed Hannah's fears. Ruth's hands were always busy, cooking, mending, scrubbing, but they were precise, almost artistic. She taught Hannah to sew before she was 10, showing her how thread could make things whole again, how fabric could be shaped and tamed. Sewing, Ruth explained, wasn't just skill, it was survival. One day she whispered, "Hannah, your hands will carry you far, but your voice can carry further than your hands ever will. Be careful what you let it say." And Hannah remembered that. Every word, every question, every small act of defiance she had learned to weigh. She grew into her early teens, moving through the plantation with the grace of someone who knew both where she could go and where she could not. She delivered meals to the mistress's daughters, carried water, swept floors, repaired torn clothes. She smiled when she had to, lowered her gaze when she must. And yet, inside, she was always watching, always learning, always noticing. Her teenage years were a balance between obedience and curiosity. There were moments of small rebellion, a carefully folded letter hidden under the mattress, a whispered story to another child in the dark of night, a question asked just a little too boldly. These moments were dangerous, of course, but they were also reminders that Hannah was still human, that even in a system designed to erase her, she had thoughts, feelings, and a voice that mattered. By the time she reached her 20s, Hannah's skill as a seamstress had become undeniable. Every stitch was neat, precise, unerring. The mistress of the house, Margaret Whitcombe, came to rely on her efficiency, though she would never admit it openly. The plantation's social structure depended on fear and order, and yet, quietly, Margaret needed Hannah to maintain that order through her skill. Clothes made it possible for the family to display power, propriety, and refinement. Hannah provided that silently, with her nimble fingers and sharp mind. But again, it was her voice that was the real danger. Even among the enslaved workers, Hannah's calm, clear manner of speaking set her apart. She did not speak loudly or foolishly, but when she pointed out a crooked seam or questioned an instruction, her words carried authority. The other women noticed. Some admired her, some feared the consequences. Some simply stayed silent, watching how she moved, how she spoke, how she dared to exist in a world designed to strip her of both. Let's linger here for a moment. Imagine the day-to-day life on that plantation, sun rising over the fields, washing everything in a golden light that belied the brutality beneath. Men and women bent over cotton, hands raw and blistered, children herding livestock, small faces streaked with dirt and sweat, dogs patrolling, overseers walking in lines, whips coiled and ready. Inside the house, polished floors reflected candlelight, laughter sometimes forced, voices measured and controlled. Every sound and every gesture was scrutinized. Every small act could tilt the balance between punishment and survival. And DST all of this. Hannah moved with quiet confidence, aware of her surroundings, aware of the dangers, aware of the power of her own words. There was a rhythm to her day, rising before dawn, preparing simple meals for herself, tending to the clothes of the household and the field hands alike. Each stitch, each fold of fabric, each correction was both labor and a statement of self-possession. In small ways, she was asserting her humanity in a system that constantly tried to deny it. And yet, she carried the constant weight of fear. That fear was not abstract. It was immediate. It lived in the twitch of an overseer's hand, the tightening of Margaret's jaw, the silence that followed a misstep. And it was during these moments of quiet labor that Hannah's mind would drift to what life might have been like outside the plantation. What would it mean to walk freely, to speak without consequence, to eat when hungry, sleep when tired, live without fear of correction or control? These thoughts were dangerous, but they were hers, and they would follow her, whispering in the back of her mind, even as her hands moved skillfully across fabric, mending the torn and making the broken whole. By the mid-1850s, Hannah was in her early 30s, fully grown into the woman who would face Margaret Whitcombe's wrath. Her reputation had grown quietly among the enslaved workers and among the household staff. People trusted her judgment, even if they feared speaking alongside her. But Margaret saw so. Nothing else entirely. She saw a challenge, a threat, because while everyone else bent, whispered, and submitted, Hannah spoke, carefully, yes, but unmistakably, and that is what led to the fateful afternoon. That small, seemingly inconsequential moment when Margaret inspected a dress, noticed a barely visible flaw, and demanded an explanation. Hannah, following all her instincts, gave it. Her voice was steady, calm, honest. And in that brief exchange, all the careful balancing of fear, skill, and self-possession met the full weight of authority. The stage was set. The threads of fate, quite literally, had begun to tighten around her. What was about to happen next would not only mark her life, but leave a scar on the collective memory of the enslaved community, a lesson whispered through generations. Hannah's story, up to this point, is about more than a single act of cruelty. It is about survival, resilience, and the quiet, steady assertion of humanity in a system designed to erase it. And it is about the dangerous power of truth, the kind that, in the wrong hands, can provoke fear, violence, and death. And so, as the sun began to set that fateful day, painting the sky in muted golds and purples, Hannah prepared for the work ahead. Little did she know, she was walking toward a moment that would test the limits of endurance, courage, and human dignity in ways no one could have predicted. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the plantation house, casting low, thin beams of light across the polished wooden floors. Dust motes danced lazily in the amber glow, almost suspended in time. The air inside was thick, not from heat, but from expectation. Every creak of the floorboards, every soft shuffle of fabric, every almost silent cough seemed amplified. Imagine that for a second. The quiet before the storm, when even the smallest sound feels like it might shatter everything. That is the moment when Hannah walked toward Margaret Whitcombe, the mistress of the house, carrying the dress that would become the spark for what was to come. Hannah's hands were steady. Her fingers, calloused from years of meticulous work, smoothed the fabric over her lap before presenting it. Her eyes, sharp and calm, lifted to meet Margaret's. And in that gaze you could see a mix of fear and determination. Fear because she knew the weight of speaking, truth to power, and determination because she could not, would not, lie about what she saw. Margaret stood, a figure of authority in a stiff, starched dress. Her posture was rigid, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the garment with the intensity of a woman used to having her world perfectly controlled. And when her gaze settled on a seam, barely noticeable, it tightened, just a fraction, but enough to change the trajectory of everything. She extended a hand, the finger sharp as a blade, and said, "Explain?" Hannah looked down at the fabric. She swallowed, a small, deliberate movement, and then spoke. "It's cut wrong, ma'am, from the start. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it wasn't defiant in a way that shouted. But it was honest. And honesty, in a place built on submission, was the most dangerous thing a person could wield." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes narrowed. That subtle tightening, that almost imperceptible clench of the jaw, is what happens when someone senses authority slipping, even for the briefest moment. Margaret asked her to repeat the words. Hannah did. Calm, steady, unflinching. And in that second, everything shifted. What Margaret saw was no longer a seamstress pointing out a mistake. She saw a slave correcting her, speaking back, defying the rules written by a system that demanded silence, talking back. Now most plantations had patterns of punishment, whippings, starvation, isolation, public humiliation. But Margaret's mind worked differently. She wanted something symbolic, something that would mark Hannah as a lesson, a warning to anyone else who might consider the audacity of honesty. She wanted fear, and fear in her mind could be sewn thread by thread. That night the plan was set. Hannah was escorted behind the house. No crowd, no witnesses. Just Margaret, 2 overseers, and the tools of her own trade, a sewing kit, needles and thread. The irony was as cruel as it was calculated. Instruments Hannah had used to create, to mend, to preserve, were about to be twisted into instruments of punishment. The lantern swung in the hand of one of the overseers, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls of the small enclosed space. The smell of damp earth mixed with smoke from the nearby fireplace and the metallic tang of blood. Every movement was deliberate, every glance measured. You could feel the tension wrapping around the moment like a suffocating blanket. Hannah understood immediately what was happening. Her mind raced, not with panic, though fear was there, but with a sharp, acute awareness. Every stitch, every thread, every movement of the overseer's hands was being watched, calculated. And still, she remained steady, her breathing controlled, her eyes fixed on the lantern's trembling light. The process began slowly, almost ceremoniously. Stitch by stitch, her mouth was forced closed. The coarse thread cut into her skin, swelling her lips, drawing blood. Not enough to kill her immediately, but enough to hurt, enough to humiliate, enough to warn. Every stitch was a word taken from her. Every loop of thread a mark of her obedience enforced against her will. But the cruelty, as so often in these hidden moments, had unforeseen consequences. Hannah could not eat, she could not drink. Infection settled into the swollen, wounded flesh of her mouth. By the second day, the pain had grown unbearable. By the third, she collapsed. Other enslaved women, witnessing the aftermath in hushed whisper, rushed to her side. One pressed a damp cloth to the swelling lips, another muttered prayers under her breath. They moved with care, cautious not to attract attention, cautious not to provoke further punishment. And in those small acts of humanity, you could see the deep bonds of resilience, of shared suffering, of courage in the face of impossible fear. A doctor was finally called, not out of compassion, but out of fear. A death like this, after all, might attract attention, might bring scrutiny. When he arrived, Hannah was beyond help. The stitches were removed, but it was too late. She had inhaled blood into her lungs. That night, in the small, cramped cabin, she died. Her body shook, her chest heaved, and the quiet that followed was heavy, almost sacred in its stillness. Even after her death, her story lingered. A letter from the doctor described it as an excessive correction, a phrase so clinical it failed to capture the horror of the moment. Fragments of the tale appeared in abolitionist newspapers, stripped of her name, stripped of the humanity of the girl and woman who had dared to speak. And yet, the horror persisted. Margaret Whitcombe faced questioning, but no charges were brought. She claimed the punishment was temporary restraint, and the court accepted her word. The plantation carried on. Life continued for those who survived, for those who were forced to witness. But among the enslaved community, Hannah's story became a quiet, persistent echo, a warning, a memory, a testament. Mothers whispered it to daughters, "Be careful with your words." Elders remembered her hands, her careful hum, her quiet dignity, and some said that Margaret herself never slept well afterward, haunted by the faint sound of choking, as though guilt and fear had woven themselves into her nights. Hannah's voice had terrified a system built on silence. Even when they tried to erase it, stitch by stitch, it survived. Her story, her courage, and her humanity persisted, and that is the moment we must linger on. The danger of speaking the truth in a world designed to deny it. The resilience of a human spirit that refuses to be silenced, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. The cabin where Hannah had died was quiet now. Too quiet. The flickering candlelight that had once highlighted her struggle now cast shadows across empty, rough-hewn walls. The damp scent of sweat, blood, and fear lingered in the air, settling like a weight over everything. Outside, the cicadas still screamed, oblivious to human suffering, their relentless chorus a cruel reminder that life, indifferent and endless, went on. Other enslaved women gathered in hushed groups, their faces pale in the dim light, eyes wide with grief and fear. Some sat on the floor, backs pressed against the walls, hands clutching each other as if their touch alone could stave off the horror of what they had witnessed. Others whispered quietly, careful not to let their voices carry beyond the cabin, passing Saint Ories and warnings to those who might not have seen the worst. "Be careful," they murmured. "Watch what you say. Watch what you do." Each word was a seed of survival, a lesson born from tragedy. And yet, despite the fear, there was also memory. They remembered Hannah, not the stitches, not the blood, not the silence forced upon her, but the woman she had been before the punishment. Her hands, skilled and steady, the quiet hum she carried while she worked, the way her eyes, sharp and perceptive, could notice things others missed. In these memories, Hannah lived on, not as a victim, but as someone who had insisted, in the only way she could, on being human. Margaret Whitcombe, meanwhile, carried her own shadows. In the days following Hannah's death, some servants whispered that she paced the house at night, restless, haunted by sounds only she could hear. A cough here, a choking sound there. Simple noises, perhaps, but enough to make her pause, to make her glance over her shoulder, to make her heart hammer in a chest that had once been so sure of its authority. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps fear, perhaps imagination. But there is something haunting about a person who believes they have punished someone fully, only to find that punishment lingering in ways they cannot control. The doctor's letter survived, describing the punishment clinically as an excessive correction. But within the sterile words was a raw, undeniable truth. Hannah's life had ended because she had spoken. Her voice, calm and honest, had provoked fear in a system built on silence, and the consequences were fatal. Newspapers in the North, abolitionist presses hungry for evidence of Southern cruelty, printed fragments of her story. Her name was omitted, her identity stripped, but the horror, the fact of her death, was undeniable. Readers shivered at the image of a woman's mouth forcibly closed, bleeding, struggling to breathe, and the injustice sparked outrage. Yet on the plantation, life went on. Fields were still worked, chores completed, and overseers watched with the same ruthless attentiveness. Margaret Whitcombe's authority remained unchallenged in official terms, but her personal authority, her sense of control, had subtly shifted. Those who served her began to notice the small cracks, the tight smile she forced, the sudden flinches at minor noises, the restless pacing at night. Perhaps punishment can control the body, but it cannot fully command conscience. Among the enslaved community, Hannah's story transformed into something else entirely, a quiet legend, a whisper of resistance. Mothers warn daughters, "Be careful with your words, speak softly but always think." Elders recounted her hands, her skills, the dignity with which she carried herself. And in every whispered telling, Hannah's voice, though silenced in life, grew louder in memory. There is a strange, persistent power in memory. It does not obey the rules of authority. It cannot be stitched closed or chained. And for those who lived on the plantation, for those who watched Hannah's life and death, the lesson was clear. Even in silence, one could be heard. Even in oppression, truth had a way of surviving. Now imagine walking through those fields years later, the same tall grass, the same oaks casting long shadows, the same relentless cicadas. And imagine that the earth remembers. Imagine that every footstep, every whisper, carries echoes of those who once lived, who struggled, who resisted in ways both quiet and profound. Hannah's life, her courage, her voice, all became part of that memory, woven into the fabric of the land itself. We can linger here for a moment because this is where the story becomes more than a single tragedy. It becomes a reflection on human nature, the cruelty humans are capable of, yes, but also the resilience, the quiet dignity, the ability to resist in ways that survive even when the body does not. Hannah's story is about both loss and strength, about how even in the darkest places, the human spirit can leave a mark that cannot be erased. Margaret Whitcombe's life continued as well, but in ways more subtle, more insidious. Some reports suggest she never slept peacefully again. Some say she claimed to hear Hannah's breathing, the faint sound of someone choking, in the dead of night. Whether true or imagined, the story reflects a deeper truth. The consequences of cruelty rarely remain contained to the victim alone. The fear, the guilt, the memory, all ripple outward, haunting in ways that cannot be legislated, that cannot be sewn closed. And that is the lesson that threads through history, the moral that lingers long after the plantation has fallen into dust. The human voice, the assertion of self, is dangerous in systems built on silence. It is precious. It is powerful. And even when a system tries to erase it, it survives. Hannah's voice, though silenced in life, echoes across centuries. It lives in the whispers, in the stories passed down, in the warning to be cautious but in the reminder to remain human. As we reflect on Hannah's story, we are reminded of the small moments that reveal the depth of human courage, the careful stitch, the whispered word, the steady gaze that refuses to break. In the quiet, in the shadows, in the places history sometimes forgets, those moments endure. They remind us that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, humanity persists. Even when voices are forcibly silenced, they speak to us still.